good to be here. I'm glad that you showed up. I was worried about getting here and nobody being here. So I'm thankful you're here. From what I understand, we're studying some Bible characters, and which Bible character do you think, which Old Testament Bible character do you think is mentioned more often in the New Testament than any other? And I'll give you a clue. It's the one we're studying about tonight. Abraham. More often than Moses, more often than David, even though both of them are mentioned. Abraham is mentioned more often in the New Testament than any other Old Testament character. Why would you think that? Why would you think Abraham would be so important? Because of the promise that God made to him when he called him out of Ur. What do you know about Ur? All right, land of the Chaldees. It's in Mesopotamia. Ur was located close to the Persian Gulf. It was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was some of the most fertile land in the world. And those who lived outside the city of Ur primarily did farming, primarily raised crops, and they were very prosperous in their farming, in the way they took care of things and what they had. So it was a very prosperous area. The city of Ur itself, from everything I can find and read, was really only about 25,000 people. And I say only about, but it was a city of about 25,000 people. Every house in that city was said to have been 2 stories high, and said they lined every street that went through the city. Said everybody lived in a 2-story building, house. But there were 25,000 that lived inside the city and formed the city, but there were 200,000 that lived just outside the cities and did all the farming all around. So it was a very large place, and it was a prosperous place. Abraham comes from that area. Coming from that area and coming out of that area, God called him out of that in Genesis chapter 11 and 12. In chapter 12, he's calling him to come out of that land. Did Abraham have anything? Had Abraham been very successful when God called him? Anybody have any idea about how old he is when he's called? He's about 75. Anybody got any ideas about how prosperous he was, or if he had anything or didn't have anything, or did he get all of his wealth later, or did he leave Ur with something? He was a pretty wealthy man. As a matter of fact, at one point it talks about him, and it's talking about his wealth. It says that he had 300 servants born in his house. 318, I think, is the exact number. Well, if you've got 318 servants being born in your house, that means you've got a pretty good sized household, doesn't it? And that's counting those that were your servants, those that were your workers. That's the whole amount of people that he had. But when it talks about Abraham as sojourning in this land that God had promised him, I want you to understand that from everything I know, Abraham wasn't just grabbing Sarah and saying, Sarah, we're going to move. We're having some troubles, and so me and you are going to have to move. When he moved, there was a large contingency of people that were moving with him. He had a large numbers of people that he took care of that were a part of his household. And so Abraham has all of these, and among these he has a nephew. Anybody know what his name was? Lot. Had a nephew, Lot. Abraham, with his flocks and herds and with everything that he had, Abraham had everything going real well for him, and he and Lot got along well, but what was happening with their herdsmen? Oh, they were bickering and fighting, right? And so Abraham tells Lot to do what? What does he tell him? He says, let there be no strife between me and thee, between thy herdmen and my herdmen. He said, because we do what? Because we're brethren. And brethren, he says, ought not to be squabbling and fighting and fussing and feuding with one another. Now what he said? You know, that's still pretty good advice for brethren today. That didn't cost you anything. I just thought I'd throw that in. Here he is, and he is someone who has this large contingency that he has, and now he tells Lot, He says, Lot, we don't need to be arguing. We don't need to have this fighting. We don't need to have this. Our herdsmen are getting on each other's nerves, and things aren't like they ought to be. And besides that, when we're having all of these kinds of things that are going on among us, what are these folks outside thinking? If we're feuding and fighting among ourselves, what are our enemies thinking? What are those people out here in the land that don't like us being here anyway? What are they thinking? Why, they're making fun of them. They're talking about them. And the result of that is that he said, we don't need to be doing this, and there doesn't need to be this kind of division among us. And he said, so the result of that is, he said, you choose what land you'll take. He said, if you take the land here, he said, I'll go there. If you go this way, I'll go there. Just you pick the land you want. Well, Lot being the nephew, Lot would do what most would do, didn't he? I mean, he determined in his mind and say, you know, Lot's my uncle, and he's taken care of me, and he's provided for me, and he's given to me, and because of him, I'm being greatly blessed. And so I'm going to take some of the sorriest land that there is and give him the best. Do you think that's what he did? That's not what he did, was it? What did he take? Oh, he took the best of the land, right? Was it a good decision? Why not? Because the best of the land, the best part of the land, the best as you would look out and see what would be the best land to have, was in the land of Sodom. Now, he didn't first move into Sodom. He didn't just move there and move into Sodom immediately. What did he do? Well, first of all, he lived outside. Didn't go into the cities immediately. And Lot himself is a just man. The New Testament says he was. Peter said he was just Lot. He called him just Lot. A righteous man. But you know where he made a real grave mistake? He moved his family into the city. And though he may have been strong, and though he may have had the strength to be able to withstand and to stand against all of those that were opposing and all of those that were doing what they were doing, his family got caught up in that. So that in Genesis chapters 18 and 19, you've got the angel of the Lord appearing to Abraham and telling him what's going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. And you all remember that Abraham then begins to plead with God for Lot. And he says, would you destroy them if I can find 50 righteous souls? Now what he said? What did God say? God said, okay, go ahead. Then what did Abraham say? Well, you know, 50 is a whole lot. How about 45? How about 40? How about 30? How about 20? How about 10? And by the way, when we're talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, you ought to understand that if you go back and spend all the time, and I'm not going to do that, but if you go back and look, there were actually 5 cities that made up this area. There were 5 cities that were involved. And so when the time comes and God says if you can find 10 righteous souls, he's talking about 10 righteous souls in 5 cities. 10 righteous souls in 5 cities could have saved Sodom and Gomorrah. But you didn't have 10 righteous souls in 5 cities. You know, the only thing I can think of that was worse than that was when Jeremiah was sent to go through the city of Jerusalem with a lantern at night and said, find me one. Find me a man. Find me a man. Just one. And Jeremiah went through the city all night with his lantern looking. And when he came back, what did he have? He couldn't find one. Isn't that a sad state of affairs? Now, brethren, I trust that you who live here in Harrisburg and who are members of the body of Christ and you're Christians and you're walking with the Lord, I trust that we'd find more than 50 righteous souls in Harrisburg. But they couldn't find 50. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Not only was Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed, what happened to Lot's wife? God said, do not look back. She looked back. What happened to her? turned into a pillar of salt. Turned into a pillar of salt because of looking back. Here we are with Abraham. Abraham, and that's who I want to spend my time talking about. I don't want to spend my time talking about Lot. In talking about Abraham, Abraham is called to leave the land of his fathers and go to a land that I'll show thee, God said. How long was it from the time God told him to leave till he left? The Bible says early in the morning he arose and went. Now, I'm not asking you to answer this. I'm just asking you to think about it. If God appeared to you, and God doesn't do that today, but if God appeared to you and told you, I want you to leave this place and go to a land I'm going to show you, a place you hadn't seen, don't know anything about, hadn't searched out, hadn't gone and looked it over. I want you to get up and leave. How quick would you be to get everything together and get out? And if you were leaving everything you've ever known, you're leaving your whole life behind. How many of us would be willing just to, God said leave, and how many of us would gather our things together and we'd go? It says something about Abraham's faith that Abraham didn't know where he was going. God didn't tell him, here's where I want you to go. God said, I want you to gather your things together, and I want you to come and go with me. Go where I tell you. And if you'll read Hebrews chapter 11, where it talks about Abraham, and I think it's verse 8, it says that he arose and went out not knowing where he was going. Think about it. God tells him, I want you to leave. I'm going to carry you to a land. I want to carry you to a place. But the reality is, I'm not going to tell you where. Just get up and go. And he arose and went. The journey itself was hundreds of miles. He went from Ur all the way up to Haran and waited in Haran for a time and then came down into the land. His father dies. Terah. And he buries his father. Goes through the difficulty of that. Friend, the first lesson I would have you to learn and have you to remember about Abraham was he was selfless and he was willing to give up everything for God. He was selfless because he wasn't concerned about himself. I've already talked about the fact that he told Lot. You know, if this was my nephew and I were the one that had I'm the one that's been taken care of, and I'm the one that's brought him out of Ur, and I'm the one that's been taken care of, I'm the one that's watched over him and all. I might have been that one that would have said, listen, Lot, here's what you're going to do. You're going to go over there and take that land over there, and I'm going to take this land. Abraham said no, said you take the best. Said you choose, you go out and look, you go out and search. Abraham wasn't so wrapped up in himself because Abraham knew that God was with him. He knew he had God on his side. He knew that God was for him. And God had made him a promise. As a matter of fact, that promise, we talked about 3 different things. Remember what they were? He promised him a land. He promised him a nation. And he promised him a seed. Do you know how long it was from the time God made the promise to Abraham until finally they realized the fulfillment of that promise? Well, until they received the fulfillment of the promise, the land promise is 430 years. Abraham never owned the land himself. It was never his himself. He lived his entire life, 175 years. He lived his entire life, the last 100 years of that life, he spends with a promise that God has made to him that is never realized in his lifetime. Never. Tells you something about Abraham, doesn't it? God made him a promise and told him, said, I'm going to give you this land. And he said not only that, but he said, I'm going to make of you a great nation. He said, here's what I'm going to do for you. Here's how I'm going to bless you. And he's trusted God and believed in God and followed God. And God has been with him all this way. And so Abraham's not deserting him now. Abraham continues to believe that there's going to be the fulfillment of that promise. First thing I learned about Abraham is that man was sacrificial. He'd give up everything to have God, serve God. He would walk away from everything he had to go where God would have him go. I also know about his compassion, because he had enough compassion for his nephew that he would take that nephew and carry him wherever it was he was going. Take care of him. Do y'all remember in Genesis chapter 12 is where Abraham's called to leave, and he does. Chapter 13 is where he tells, down in verse 8 I think it is, he says, you take, and I'll, where the division takes place, and Lot takes his land and goes. And Abraham is still looking, waiting for the promise. Now, God's shown him the land. He's been sojourning in the land. He told him that the land you're sojourning in, he said, I'm going to give it to you. And so Abraham believed that, trusted that, had every confidence in that. And in believing it and having confidence in it, he was willing to go wherever God told him. Were those in the land already, were they happy to see Abraham? Nope. As a matter of fact, Abraham would move to a place and dig a well so that he could provide water for his family and for his flocks and herds. He would build a well, dig a well, and what happened? What would people in the land do? They'd come in, run him off, take his well. All Abraham had to do at any one of those points was to say, nope, you're not getting it. God's taking care of me, and I'm staying here. And you go dig a well. Abraham didn't. He just moved to the next place. Went and dug another well. When he dug another well, had water again. God kept taking care of him all that time. God had promised him a nation. He had promised him a land. Abraham never saw any of that. He also promised him a seed. He promised him a seed. Where does seed? What's the importance of all this seed talk? What's the importance of the seed? Okay. God said to Abraham, I'm going to give you a seed. And he didn't say seeds. He said, I'm giving you a seed. And through that seed, men are going to be blessed. Do you know when the first time that seed was mentioned was? Wasn't Abraham. Anybody remember when the first time the seed was talked about? It's when Adam and Eve sinned. And when Adam and Eve sinned, God said, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed. Her seed. I hope you understand, and I trust that you do, that the seed is not in the woman except one time. You see, the seed is always in the man. So when God says to the woman it's her seed, who's he referring to? When he's talking to Adam and Eve and sins come into the world and God said, I'm going to give you a seed, who is that seed? It's Christ. That's Jesus. So now he's talking to Abraham and he says to Abraham, I'm going to give you a seed. Do you want to know how mighty and powerful our God is? Abraham, at the age of what? Has a child born? He's 100 years old. And how old was Sarah? She was 90 years old. As a matter of fact, she was old enough that she laughed at the idea of having a child, right? But at the age of 90, she had that child. And God blessed her with 37 years after that child was born. She got to see that child grow up, mature, become a man, and live for 37 years before she died. Now, lest we let our time get away from us and we start thinking that Abraham was a perfect man, Abraham wasn't perfect, was he? Nope. As a matter of fact, on 2 occasions he committed the same sin. Remember what it was? He lied. He lied. Twice. Twice he lied. What did he lie about? His wife. Now let's get back now here and think a minute. You know, she really was his kinfolk, right? So I mean, it wasn't really a big lie. It was just a little lie, wasn't it? No, it's a lie. A lie is a lie is a lie is a lie. And he lied. You know what else? Brethren, do you believe that a wife is supposed to submit to her husband? Do y'all believe that? The Bible teach that? Does? Can I pick on you? I can, because, I mean, you're here. If Brock tells Vanessa to do something that's wrong, does she have to submit to you? So I'm going to tell you something. His wife also was in the sin, because not only if she was who she should have been, you know what she should have said to him? It's what some of you wives would say to your husbands if they told you to do something that was like that. I'm going to tell you, I've got a wife. Never mind. Forget about me talking about my wife, because I got to drive home in a little bit. But I can tell you, many wives I know, if they were told, you need to go along with this sin, you need to go along with this lie, you know what she should have told him? No. We are not going to lie. If she was the right kind of wife at that point, when he's saying, here's what we need to do, she should have said, Abraham, lying's wrong, and we're not going to lie. I don't know what's going to happen, but we shouldn't be lying. And so where Abraham is caught in his lie twice, if she was the wife that she really was, she was a wonderful wife, a wonderful woman, one of the greatest women that ever lived, is Sarah. She should have told him, Abraham, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. And you wives, if your husband ever calls on you to do something that's wrong, sinful, please have the courage and the love for your husband that you tell him, no, we don't need to do that. That's wrong. And you husbands, don't be so proud and arrogant that you don't think you need to listen to anybody. Sometimes your wives have a whole lot more sense than you do. You don't believe that, but it's the truth whether you believe it or not. Let me tell you how great a woman I believe Sarah was. Do you know who the only woman in all the Bible that we are told of her being buried, and we're told how long she lived? Do you know who the only woman is that you've got her age given when she died? Do you know who the only woman was? I've given you. If you don't get this one, y'all are going to flunk this class. The only woman that God raised up enough to tell you how great she was, God said she's 127 years old, and she died. Now, I'm not telling you there weren't other great women, because the Bible's filled with some great women, but I'm going to tell you, God had enough respect for Sarah that God tells you that when she died, what happened to her? I mentioned a moment ago that Abraham never inherited this land, never owned it himself. You know there's only one little piece of ground he ever owned. You know what it was? Her tomb. Burying place for his wife. Place where he could bury his wife. It's the only piece of land he ever owned. And God had made a promise to him. And I can tell you, knowing me, that there would have been some times I would have been questioning God and saying, you know, did I misunderstand you? Did you tell me I was going to be given a land? Abraham believed it. It's interesting to me how that every time God told Abraham to do something, Abraham didn't argue about it, and Abraham didn't run from it. Abraham immediately did what God told him. Whatever it was. If God told him to rise and go, he arose and went. God had given him that seed that he'd promised him at the age of 100. Abraham loved that son. Abraham cared greatly for that son. And God said, Abraham, I want you to take that son and I want you to build an altar up on the mount. I want you to build an altar and I want you to take your son. I want you to tie him up, lay him down on that altar, and I want you to sacrifice him. I'm going to take a knife. I'm going to kill him, and we're going to watch him be sacrificed on that altar. And when God told Abraham that's what he wanted him to do you know that Abraham again rose up early in the morning to go? Again. If that was one of my children, I've got three daughters. Would there be a time when God would tell you to sacrifice your child that you'd get up early in the morning to do it? Abraham arose early in the morning, took the lad, took all that he had, took all the things that he was going to need and everything that was necessary, took the son and went up to the mount. And in the mount, he prepared that son, laid him on the altar, had everything ready, was ready to set fire to it and watch his son be consumed, because the book of Hebrews tells me in chapter 11 that Abraham believed that if God led him to sacrifice that son and that son was in ashes laying on the ground, that God from those ashes was going to raise him up, because God had promised him something about that son. What had he promised him? That son is the seed. That son is the seed through whom the world is going to be blessed.
Do you think his faith had grown to the point at that time that he was above trying to trade God out of doing that? Because he tried to trade him out of destroying Sodom.
I think his faith grows. Absolutely. Absolutely. I don't think Abraham was any different than we are. I think our faith grows. I hope it does. If you're sitting in here and you've been a member of the church, you've been teaching and studying and reading and you know the truth, and your faith has grown over the last 50 years, should you not be stronger today than you were 50 years ago, or 40 years ago, or 30, or 20, or 10? You ought to be growing stronger every day. I would hope that that's what we were doing, was growing stronger each and every day. That would be needful and necessary. There was a time then too, I mentioned Abraham getting Sarah when she should have said no. I can tell you another time when Sarah tried to get Abraham to do something that was wrong. Remember when she thought God wasn't coming along with that son quick enough, and what'd she do? She took Hagar, her handmaid, sent him into Abraham. You know what Abraham should have said? It said what God said. God said, I would have a seed, and God promised me this, and we're not going to try to take care of God's business. So it's another occasion where Abraham should have said no, and he didn't. Abraham was not perfect. But Abraham, in his imperfection, was someone who was growing. Brethren, our faith has to grow. We ought to be stronger than what we were. We ought to be stronger in our faith today than we were last year, or 5 years ago, or 10, or whenever. We ought to be stronger in our faith. We ought to be more diligent in our faith. We ought to be more determined in our faith because of what has been done for us. Abraham was a man with conviction. Brethren, the church today needs more Abrahams that have that kind of conviction, that kind of faith, that kind of trust, that kind of confidence, that if God told us anything, we're going to do what God said. I may not understand all the ins and outs and ups and downs and whys, but if God said, that's what I'm going to do. Because God said to do it. And I'm going to do what God said regardless. I want to tell you one other thing about Abraham that I want to mention before our time gets gone. I don't know when our time's up. When's time up? Okay, we'll be here at about 9:30 then. One of the things when I think about Abraham that tells me what a great man he was he had that kind of conviction to be able to do whatever God would call upon him to do, and to do it faithfully and with intent and purpose. Another thing about Abraham that I love is the fact that when Abraham failed, and when he lied, he failed. And God called him out on it. But you know what Abraham didn't let that do? He didn't let him cause him to quit. Brethren, when Abraham's faith faltered, when it got shaky, when he started thinking about his own life and what might happen to him and what would happen and what could go on in his life, the thing that Abraham did was, Abraham said, "She's my sister." But you know, after that, and after God rebuked him for that, Abraham got up and went back to work, doing what God would have him do. Friends, sometimes things happen in our lives and we stumble. Sometimes we don't just stumble. Sometimes we just fall flat on our face. Because sometimes in weakness we allow it. The old devil just comes along and he grabs hold of us and he throws us down or trips us or whatever. And we get ourselves out of step and we get ourselves beat down. Abraham changed his life and got up and kept going. He was resilient. Isn't that what we and you ought to be? Let me tell you something. When I think of Abraham, the first thing I think of about Abraham is I think about the victories that he had in his life. And I think about how when God called him to leave Ur, he left. When God called him to offer his son, he did. Whatever God told him, he did. Whew, you were right there, Isabel. When God called upon him to do something, he did it. But I also learned that when Abraham stumbled, when Abraham fell, Abraham got back up and kept going. Sometimes if we're not careful, what we end up doing is we stumble, we get ourselves out of step, and because we've stumbled, we let our past bother us so much that it keeps us from looking ahead and getting back up and getting back in the race. If you run and you run very long, there's going to be somewhere along the way you're going to stumble. You're going to step on a rock. You're going to step on something that's going to cause you to stumble and fall. And the thing you got to do is get back up and get back in the race. Don't quit. Don't give up. Yes, sir.
You know, when we study men like Abraham, I think about David, I think about others, it
Absolutely.
It's almost like the academia. Let's talk about the mistakes they made and all the details involved in that. And the Bible really doesn't emphasize it. They emphasize that Abraham's faithful.
Yes. It also tells me how merciful God is and how forgiving He is. Because when Abraham got himself up and kept going, God didn't say, well, Abraham, you've messed up so bad, you've just been lying and doing these things, and I'm going to have to find somebody else. And then what happened? He got back up and kept on, and God was continuing to be with him, and God did continue to be with him. God was with him. Abraham was loyal to God in everything that he did. Did he make mistakes? For sure he did. And I'm going to tell you, if you're a Christian, you're going to make some mistakes along the way. You're not going to be perfect. I don't care how hard you try. You're not going to be perfect. You're going to stumble somewhere, somehow. I hope you and I have the kind of resilience that Abraham had, where when he stumbled, he got himself back up and went back to work. Kept on. He didn't give up. He didn't quit. He didn't stop. He continued to be loyal to God and to his cause all the days of his life. I want to close with this. God paid to Abraham what I think is one of the greatest compliments ever God has given to a man. He called Abraham his friend. He's called the friend of God. I think that's a pretty high praise that was given, don't you? I think that's pretty high standard to say that he was the friend of God. You raised Abraham up, and you've said, this man was God's friend. We sing the song sometimes, I'll be a friend. Y'all ever sing that song? Yeah. To Jesus. Can I tell you something else that shows you the power of God? God promised Abraham he's going to have a seed, so he had to have a son. You start reading about the generations beginning with Abraham and start reading through all those generations in Genesis chapter 1, where probably what you do and what I do sometimes is I get to chapter 1 of Matthew and I'm reading along, or I get to Luke chapter 3 and it's talking about this one begat this one, and this one begat that one, and this one begat another, and I just kind of go from there down to here and pick back up. Because it's just a lot of begatting. You want to say something to me? This is just to me, and maybe it's because I have 3 daughters. Everywhere in that seed line, God can be seen, because every one of those men had a son. Just think about it. You didn't have Judah that came along and God said, I'm going to send this Savior, I'm going to send this seed through Judah. And Judah had a son. And every time he talked about one that was going to be carrying that seed, every time he had a son. Well, how many? Okay, I'm through. Whoa. No, it's just, you see Abraham, and Abraham was one of the great characters for us to try to emulate and for us to try to follow. Wasn't perfect, but he kept his eye on the goal. And you see the power of God in that through those individuals, every one of them had a son. And to me, that says something about God in the seed line and how God preserved it, took care of it, and how he's always done.